Before we begin, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps bring more soothing stories your way. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. The fluorescent lights of the local grocery store cast a harsh glow on the crowded aisles. Angela Johnson pushed a squeaky-wheeled cart with her two children in tow, their expressions a mix of fatigue and hunger. The holiday season was just around the corner, and the store was alive with an almost frenzied energy. Cheerful Christmas carols played overhead, but the cheerful atmosphere did little to lift Angela's spirits. Her cart held only the essentials: a loaf of white bread, a pack of eggs, a few cans of soup, and a box of instant macaroni. Angela's stomach churned as she mentally calculated the cost. She knew every penny in her wallet by heart, $20 or $8.45, mostly in food stamps. "Mama," Maya said softly, tugging at Angela's sleeve, "can we get the cookies too?" She pointed to a festive display of sugar cookies shaped like snowflakes, neatly arranged in a shiny plastic container. Angela knelt down, brushing a strand of Maya's curly hair behind her ear. "Not today, sweetie," she said, forcing a smile. "Maybe next time." Maya pouted, but she didn't argue. At just 7 years old, she was already learning the heavy lessons of scarcity. Behind them, Jalen stood silently, his teenage frame taller than his mother's, but his demeanor subdued. He hated these trips to the store, hated the way his mother's face would tighten at the register, and the way the cashier's expression sometimes changed when they saw the EBT card. The family finally made it to the checkout line, which stretched back several feet. Angela gripped the handle of the cart, her knuckles white. She could feel the judgmental stares of the customers behind her, some of whom glanced at her kids, then at her meager groceries, their gazes heavy with unspoken assumptions. "You okay, Mom?" Jalen asked quietly, standing close to shield her from the stares as best he could. "Yeah, baby," Angela replied, though her voice wavered. Two people back in the line, a man in a hoodie and a baseball cap, observed the family with quiet interest. He had been shopping too, but his cart held an assortment of items far more expensive than Angela's: organic produce, steaks, and a bottle of wine. Despite his inconspicuous clothing, there was something about him, an energy, a presence, that made him stand out. The man's eyes lingered on the young boy, who was now trying to distract his little sister by making goofy faces. The girl giggled, her laughter a small, defiant burst of joy amidst the tension. Finally, it was Angela's turn. She began unloading her items onto the conveyor belt with meticulous care, as if handling fragile treasures. When the cashier finished scanning, Angela braced herself. "Your total is $43.27, the cashier announced. Angela's heart sank. She knew it would be close, but she had hoped, prayed, that her calculations were wrong. She handed over her EBT card and a small bundle of wrinkled bills. The cashier swiped the card, then frowned. "It's not covering everything, ma'am. You're short by $15. Angela's face flushed. She opened her wallet, fumbling through it in vain. Jalen looked up at her, his eyes filled with a quiet, helpless anger, not at his mother, but at the situation. "Maybe we can put some things back," Angela said, her voice barely audible. She reached for the eggs, prepared to return them, when a deep, calm voice interrupted. "I've got it," the man behind her said, stepping forward. Angela turned, startled. The man was already pulling out a crisp $20 bill, handing it to the cashier with a nonchalant air. "Cover the difference and let her keep the change." For a moment, Angela was speechless. "Oh, no, sir, I can't." "Please," the man said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's nothing." Jalen stared at the man, squinting. There was something familiar about him, though he couldn't quite place it. The man's voice carried an unmistakable gravitas, and his broad shoulders seemed too imposing for someone so humble. "Thank you," Angela finally said, her voice cracking with emotion. The man nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "No need to thank me. Just take care of these kids. They're good kids." As the cashier bagged their groceries, Angela noticed something peculiar. Other customers, who had been casting judgmental glances earlier, now seemed subdued, as if witnessing the man's kindness had shamed them. As Angela and her children walked out of the store, the man followed a few steps behind, carrying his own groceries. Unbeknownst to the Johnsons, this encounter was only the beginning. The evening air was crisp as the Johnsons stepped out of the grocery store. their worn plastic bags rustling in Angela's hands. The parking lot was dimly lit, and the hum of engines mixed with the occasional sound of a distant car horn. Angela glanced over her shoulder at Jalen, who carried the heavier bags with quiet determination, and Maya skipping a few steps ahead, oblivious to the weight her mother carried in her heart. As they approached their old dented sedan, Angela sighed. The car was a constant source of anxiety. Balding tires, an engine that sputtered unpredictably, and a faint smell of gasoline that never seemed to go away. She set the groceries down carefully and unlocked the trunk. "Let me help you with that," came the familiar, deep voice from behind. Angela turned, startled to see the man from the grocery store standing a few feet away, holding his own bags. He offered a friendly smile, his presence strangely comforting rather than invasive. "Oh, you've already done more than enough," Angela said, shaking her head. "We can manage." The man tilted his head slightly as if weighing her words. "I don't mind," he said simply. "I was taught to help where I can." Jalen, standing nearby, shot his mother a look. "Come on, Mom. He's just being nice." Angela hesitated but eventually nodded, stepping aside. The man set his bags on the ground and lifted the heavier ones into the trunk with an ease that suggested years of physical training. "You live far from here?" he asked casually as he worked. "About 10 minutes, Angela replied, her tone guarded. The man looked over at their car, taking in the rusted doors and faded paint. "That thing holding up okay?" "Barely," Angela admitted with a small, humorless laugh. "But it gets us where we need to go. Most of the time." Maya, who had been busy inspecting a crack in the pavement, suddenly piped up. "Sometimes it makes funny noises. Like this." She scrunched up her face and made a loud sputtering sound, drawing a chuckle from both Jalen and the man. Angela shook her head, embarrassed but unable to suppress a smile. "Kids." After loading the last bag, the man stepped back, brushing his hands on his jeans. "You know," he said, "I'm heading in the same direction. If you need a ride, I can take you." Angela's first instinct was to refuse. She barely knew this man, and while his actions so far had been nothing but kind, the world had taught her to be cautious. "That's kind of you," she said carefully, "but we'll manage. I don't want to trouble you any more than I already have." "It's no trouble," he replied, his tone reassuring. "I get it, being wary. But look, it's cold out, and that car of yours looks like it could use a break. I promise, it's just a ride." Angela hesitated, glancing at her children. Jalen nodded, his expression suggesting a cautious trust. Maya, oblivious to the tension, was already climbing into the back seat of their car, her energy fading after the long day. Finally, Angela relented. "Okay," she said, "but just this once." The man's face brightened with a smile, and he gestured toward a sleek black SUV parked a few spaces away. Its polished exterior gleamed under the parking lot lights, a stark contrast to their old sedan. As the family transferred their groceries into the man's car, Jalen couldn't help but stare. "This is your?" he asked, running a hand along the smooth surface of the door. "Yeah," the man replied casually. "She's a good ride. Reliable." The boy raised an eyebrow. "You must have a pretty good job." The man laughed, a deep, resonant sound. "I've been lucky," he said, "but I've had my share of struggles too." Once everyone was settled in the car, the man turned to Angela. "Where to?" Angela gave him their address, her nerves settling slightly as they pulled out of the parking lot. The warmth of the SUV's heater and the faint scent of leather made her realize just how cold she had been. "Thank you," she said quietly, her words carrying a weight of gratitude that went beyond the groceries and the ride. The man glanced at her through the rear-view mirror, his eyes kind but unreadable. "Like I said," he replied, "no need to thank me. Just doing what I can." As they drove through the quiet streets, Angela couldn't help but wonder about this stranger. There was something about him, his voice, his posture, the way he carried himself, that felt familiar yet mysterious. She didn't know it yet, but this chance encounter was about to change her family's life forever. The SUV cruised through the quiet streets, its engine humming smoothly as the Johnson family sat in a comfortable, stunned silence. Maya had dozed off in the back seat, her head resting on Jalen's shoulder, while Angela kept glancing out the window, her mind racing with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. The man whose calm presence filled the car occasionally glanced at them in the rearview mirror. He drove confidently, navigating the turns without a GPS, as if he had been down these roads before. "Nice neighborhood," he said, breaking the silence. "Reminds me of where I grew up." Angela turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "You grew up in a neighborhood like this?" The man chuckled. "Well, maybe a little rougher," he admitted. "But yeah, I know what it's like to have more worries than money." His words struck a chord with Angela. She studied him closely. The slight scar on his left eyebrow, the broad shoulders, and the way he carried himself with a quiet confidence that felt earned, not assumed. There was something undeniably familiar about him, though she couldn't place why. "I don't mean to pry," she said carefully, "but you don't seem like someone who struggles anymore. What do you do for a living?" The man paused as if weighing his answer. "Let's just say I've been fortunate," he replied. "But I've been where you are, Angela, and I'll never forget that." Angela's stomach flipped. She hadn't told him her name. "How do you—" "Your son said it at the store," he explained quickly, his tone apologetic. "Sorry if I spooked you." Angela exhaled, her tension easing. "It's okay. I guess I'm just not used to strangers being so generous." The man smiled but said nothing more as he pulled into the small, run-down apartment complex where the Johnsons lived. The building's chipped paint and flickering porch light told a story of its own, one the man seemed to understand without asking. After parking, he stepped out and began unloading their groceries without being asked. Angela and Jalen joined him, their arms full as they carried the bags up the narrow stairwell to the second-floor apartment. The man set the last bag down in their tiny kitchen and surveyed the space. It was clean and organized but bare, a testament to Angela's determination to make the best of what little they had. "Mama, can he stay for dinner?" Maya asked suddenly, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Angela hesitated. The idea of inviting a stranger into their home felt risky. But Maya's innocent question hung in the air, and the man looked at her with such a kind expression that her doubts began to waver. "It's not much," Angela said finally, "but if you'd like, you're welcome to join us." "I'd like that," he replied warmly. "Thank you." The family sprang into action, cobbling together a meal from the groceries they had just brought home. Jalen chopped vegetables while Maya set the table, carefully placing mismatched plates and forks. Angela heated a pot of soup, her mind still spinning from the evening's events. As they sat down to eat, the man leaned back in his chair, visibly relaxed. He watched the children with a quiet smile as they laughed and teased each other, the earlier tension of the grocery store now a distant memory. "This is nice," he said. "Reminds me of home." Angela couldn't help but press further. "You keep mentioning where you grew up. What was it like?" The man's expression softened, his gaze growing distant. "It was tough," he said. "Brownsville, Brooklyn, not an easy place to grow up, especially back then. But it taught me to fight, literally and figuratively." Jalen's ears perked up. "Fight? Like boxing?" The man chuckled. "Yeah, exactly like boxing. It was my way out." Jalen leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Wait a minute, are you—" Angela frowned. "Jalen, don't be rude." "No, Mom, I'm serious," Jalen said, his voice growing excited. "Are you Mike Tyson?" The room fell silent. Angela's eyes widened, her spoon clattering against her bowl. Maya's jaw dropped, though she seemed more intrigued by her brother's reaction than the name itself. The man smiled sheepishly, removing his baseball cap and setting it on the table. "Yeah," he said. "That's me." Angela blinked, struggling to process the revelation. "You're telling me the man who bought my groceries and gave us a ride home is the Mike Tyson?" Mike shrugged. "Just a guy who's been where you are," he said humbly. The family sat in stunned silence for a moment before Maya broke it with a giggle. "Mama, we had dinner with a famous person." Mike laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Famous or not, I'm just glad I could help." Angela shook her head, still reeling. "Why us? Why did you help us?" Mike's expression turned serious. "Because I saw myself in your son," he said, looking at Jalen. "I saw a kid with potential, stuck in a tough spot, just like I was. And I know what it's like to feel like no one's in your corner." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Angela felt a lump rise in her throat, and Jalen sat straighter, his chest swelling with an unspoken sense of pride. As the evening wore on, the Johnsons began to realize that this encounter was no coincidence. Mike Tyson had walked into their lives for a reason, and his unexpected kindness was just the beginning of something much bigger. The Johnsons sat around their modest dinner table, the chipped edges of its surface unnoticed in the glow of the moment. The soup and sandwiches Angela had hastily prepared seemed to take on a special significance, not because of their taste, but because of the man seated at their table, Mike Tyson. Angela, still reeling from the revelation, stole glances at him as he casually ate his sandwich. He seemed so ordinary, despite the legendary stories attached to his name. Maya, who was too young to grasp the full weight of his identity, watched him with fascination. Jalen, on the other hand, couldn't take his eyes off him, his excitement barely contained. "So," Jalen began, unable to help himself, "what's it like, being you?" Mike paused, looking up from his plate. He smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "Being me? That's a complicated question, kid." Jalen leaned forward, hungry for more. "But you're like one of the best boxers in history. You're famous. Isn't that amazing?" Mike chuckled, the sound tinged with a hint of melancholy. "It has its moments," he admitted, "but fame doesn't erase where you come from or what you've been through. If anything, it makes it harder to outrun." Angela, who had been quietly listening, frowned. "What do you mean?" Mike set down his fork, his gaze turning distant. "I grew up in Brownsville. Back then, it wasn't a place where people dream big. Most of us were just trying to survive. My mom worked herself to the bone, but we were always struggling. I got into a lot of trouble as a kid, stealing, fighting. I even ended up in juvenile detention. People wrote me off before I even had a chance." Jalen's eyes widened. "But then you became a champion," he said, almost reverently. Mike nodded. "Yeah, but it wasn't magic. I had people who believed in me. People like Customato, my trainer. He saw something in me when no one else did. He taught me discipline, gave me structure, and reminded me I was worth more than the labels people slapped on me." Angela folded her hands on the table, her voice quiet. "Sounds like you had a lot of challenges to overcome." Mike looked at her, his eyes serious. "I did, but so do you. So does every family trying to make it in a world that doesn't always make space for them. That's why I try to help when I can." Jalen sat back, absorbing Mike's words. He hadn't expected such raw honesty from someone he considered larger than life. Maya, sensing the somber tone, piped up to break the tension. "Did you always have tigers?" she asked, her wide eyes sparkling with curiosity. Mike laughed, the sound lightening the mood instantly. "Not always," and he said. "The tigers came later, but they were a lot of work, let me tell you." Jalen shook his head in disbelief. "Tigers? Seriously? That's wild." The family laughed together, the shared warmth breaking through the earlier tension. Angela found herself relaxing, letting her guard down as Mike continued to share stories about his life, both the good and the bad. "What about you?" Mike asked after a while, his tone turning curious. "What's your story?" Angela hesitated, unsure of how much to share, but something about Mike's openness made her feel safe. "It's nothing as interesting as she began, but it hasn't been easy. I work 2 jobs, cleaning offices during the day and waiting tables at night. But it's still not enough most months. Their father," she trailed off, glancing at Jalen and Maya. "It's okay, Mom," Jalen said softly. Angela nodded, continuing. "He left when Maya was a baby. Since then, it's just been the 3 of us. We get by, but some days it feels like the world's just waiting for us to fail." Mike's expression grew serious, his gaze steady. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "I can see it, and you've got 2 amazing kids who clearly look up to you." Angela blinked back tears, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "What about you, Jalen?" Mike asked, turning to the boy. "What's your dream?" Jalen hesitated, glancing at his mother. "I don't know," he said finally. "I guess I've never really thought about it. When you're just trying to help your family get by, Dreaming feels selfish. Mike shook his head firmly. Dreaming isn't selfish. It's necessary. It's what keeps you moving forward. And you've got something special, kid. I could see it back at the store, the way you stepped up for your mom and sister. You've got heart. Jalen sat up a little straighter, his cheeks flushing with pride. Have you ever thought about boxing? Mike asked. Jalen's eyes lit up. Me? Boxing? I mean, I've seen videos of you and Allie and all the greats, but I've never. Doesn't matter if you've never done it before, Mike interrupted. What matters is if you're willing to try. Boxing isn't just about fighting. It's about discipline, focus, and learning how to pick yourself up every time you get knocked down. Angela watched the exchange with a mixture of apprehension and hope. You really think he could do it? She asked. Mike smiled. I know he could, and if he's interested, I can help him get started. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the offer sinking in. For the first time in years, Angela felt a spark of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this chance encounter was the beginning of something better for her family. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the Johnsons' apartment windows, casting a warm glow on their modest home. Angela stood by the sink, washing dishes as Jalen and Maya sat at the small kitchen table, finishing the last of their cereal. The events of the previous evening still hung in the air, like an unspoken question. Do you think he was serious? Jalen asked, breaking the silence. Angela turned off the faucet and dried her hands. About what, baby? About helping me. About boxing. Angela looked at her son, her heart aching at the mixture of hope and doubt in his eyes. She wanted to shield him from disappointment, but she also didn't want to smother the spark of excitement that Mike Tyson had ignited. I think so, she said cautiously. He doesn't seem like the kind of man to say something he doesn't mean. As if summoned by their conversation, there was a knock at the door. Angela wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened it to find Mike Tyson standing there, a gym bag slung over his shoulder. Good morning, he said with a grin. Ready to get started, champ? Jalen's mouth fell open. Wait, you're serious? Of course I'm serious, Mike replied, stepping inside. Didn't I say you've got potential? Angela watched the exchange, her emotions a mix of apprehension and gratitude. Mr. Tyson, she began, I appreciate what you're doing, but we can't afford gym memberships or anything like that. Mike waved her off. Don't worry about that. I've got it covered. There's a gym I go to that's owned by an old friend of mine. It's not fancy, but it's a place to start. Why are you doing this? Angela asked, her voice tinged with both suspicion and curiosity. Mike looked her in the eye, his expression earnest. Because someone did it for me, he said simply. When I was Jalen's age, I had nothing but a chip on my shoulder and a lot of anger. Boxing gave me an outlet, a purpose. I see that same fire in him. I just want to help him channel it. Angela nodded slowly, her heart softening. Okay, she said. If Jalen wants to do this, then thank you. Jalen practically jumped out of his chair. I want to do it. When can we start? Right now, Mike said, slinging his bag onto his shoulder. Go get some sneakers, kid. The gym was small and unassuming, nestled in the heart of the neighborhood. The faint smell of sweat and rubber greeted them as they walked inside, along with the rhythmic sound of gloves hitting heavy bags. Fighters of all ages trained in the open space, their movements purposeful and intense. Jalen's eyes widened as he took it all in. This place is amazing. It's a second home, Mike said, clapping a hand on the boy's shoulder. And now it's yours too. He led Jalen to an open corner of the gym and handed him a pair of gloves from his bag. Let's see what you've got, Mike said, pointing to a nearby heavy bag. Jalen slipped on the gloves and squared up awkwardly. His punches were wild, uncoordinated, and lacked power, but Mike nodded approvingly. Good, Mike said. You've got enthusiasm. Now let's work on technique. For the next hour, Mike guided Jalen through the basics: how to stand, how to throw a proper jab, and how to keep his balance. Other gym-goers stopped to watch, murmuring amongst themselves about the legendary Mike Tyson taking a young kid under his wing. When the session ended, Jalen was drenched in sweat but grinning from ear to ear. That was awesome, he said, his voice breathless. You've got heart, kid, Mike said, handing him a bottle of water. But heart only gets you so far. If you want to be great, you've got to put in the work. Every day. I will, Jalen promised. As they left the gym, Mike turned to Angela, who had watched the entire session from the sidelines. You've got a good kid, he said. He listens. He works hard. That's rare. Angela smiled, the pride in her son shining through. Thank you, she said softly, for believing in him. Mike nodded. Like I said, I've been where you are, and I know how much it means to have someone in your corner. Angela looked at him, her gratitude mingled with a growing sense of hope. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the weight on her shoulders was a little lighter. As they drove home, Jalen sat in the back seat, already dreaming of his next session. Angela glanced at him through the rearview mirror, her heart swelling with a cautious optimism. Mike had shared his struggles, but more importantly, he had shared his belief that they could overcome theirs. And as they pulled up to their apartment, Angela couldn't help but wonder if this chance encounter was the beginning of a new chapter for her family. A chapter where struggle was no longer the defining story. Weeks turned into months, and Jalen began training regularly at the gym. Each session was a grueling mix of sweat and determination, but under Mike Tyson's guidance, the boy began to transform. His punches became sharper, his footwork more precise, and his confidence grew with every session. At home, Angela noticed the change too. Jalen carried himself differently, not with arrogance, but with a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. He helped Maya with her homework without being asked and began keeping up with chores around the apartment. The discipline of boxing was shaping not only his skills, but also his character. One crisp Saturday morning, Mike picked Jalen up for their usual session. As they drove to the gym, Jalen glanced out the window, the city streets bustling with life. He turned to Mike, his voice tentative. Mike, he began, can I ask you something? Shoot, Mike replied, keeping his eyes on the road. Why do you do this? I mean, you could be doing anything. Traveling, relaxing. Why spend your time on me? Mike smiled, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Because someone did it for me, he said. When I was your age, I had people who didn't give up on me. They taught me more than just boxing. They taught me how to see beyond my circumstances. Jalen nodded, letting the words sink in. Do you ever think about the people you couldn't help? Like people who didn't make it out? All the time, Mike said, his voice quieter now. But that's why I keep going. I can't change the past, but I can do something about the present. And maybe that's enough. That afternoon, after an especially intense training session, Mike handed Jalen a pair of boxing gloves. They were worn but still sturdy, the leather creased from years of use. These were my first gloves, Mike said. They've been with me through a lot. Now they're yours. Jalen stared at the gloves, his hands trembling slightly as he took them. I don't even know what to say. Just keep working hard, Mike said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Meanwhile, Angela was finding her own way to give back. Inspired by Mike's generosity, she began volunteering at a local shelter on weekends. At first, it was just a few hours of serving meals, but over time, she became more involved, helping organize food drives, offering to babysit for struggling single mothers, and even teaching basic budgeting to young adults. One day, as she packed donated clothes into boxes, the shelter's director approached her. You've been a big help around here, the director said. Have you ever thought about working in community outreach full-time? Angela paused, surprised. I don't know. I mean, I still have my other jobs. We'd make it worth your while, the director assured her. You've got a way of connecting with people. We need that. Angela smiled, the idea sparking something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope for a better future. Back at the gym, Mike noticed that Jalen was starting to attract attention. Other young fighters watched him train, admiring his dedication. One afternoon, a boy named Malik approached him after a sparring session. Hey man, Malik said, rubbing the back of his neck. You're really good. How'd you get started? Jalen grinned, pulling off his gloves. I got lucky. Someone believed in me. Must be nice, Malik said, his voice tinged with envy. I don't have anyone like that. Jalen hesitated, then glanced at Mike, who was talking with another trainer across the gym. The memory of his first day at the gym flashed through his mind. The nerves, the awkwardness, and how Mike had guided him with patience and encouragement. "Hey," Jalen said, his voice steady. "Why don't we train together? I can show you what I've learned." Malik's eyes lit up. "For real?" "Yeah," Jalen said with a shrug. "It's what Mike would do." That evening, as Jalen recounted the story at dinner, Angela felt a swell of pride. He was learning more than just how to fight. He was learning how to lift others up, just as Mike had lifted him. "You're becoming a leader," Angela said, smiling at her son. Jalen shrugged, a shy smile creeping across his face. "I'm just trying to do what's right." Angela reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "And that makes all the difference." Later that night, as Angela tucked Maya into bed, the little girl looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mama," Maya said, "do you think Jalen will be famous like Mike Tyson?" Angela smiled, brushing a curl away from Maya's face. "I don't know about famous," she said, "but I know he's going to make a difference." As Angela turned off the lights and closed the door, she realized that her family was changing, not just surviving but thriving. And it all began with a simple act of kindness from a stranger who saw their potential. Months later, the gym buzzed with energy as a local amateur boxing tournament filled the space with spectators, fighters, and trainers. The air smelled of sweat and adrenaline, and the rhythmic pounding of gloves against heavy bags served as a constant backdrop. Jalen stood in the locker room, his hands wrapped tightly, his borrowed gloves resting on the bench beside him. The walls were covered in motivational posters and pictures of past champions, some faded with time. Jalen stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror, his nerves swirling in his stomach. "Hey," came Mike's voice behind him. Jalen turned to see his mentor leaning casually against the doorway, dressed in his signature hoodie and a determined expression. "You nervous?" Mike asked. Jalen nodded, exhaling sharply. "A little." "Okay, a lot." Mike smiled and stepped closer, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Good. That means you care. Just remember, this isn't about winning or losing. It's about proving to yourself that you belong here." Jalen swallowed hard and nodded again. "And one more thing," Mike added, his voice lowering. "No matter what happens out there, you've already won. You've put in the work and you've shown heart. That's what matters." The crowd erupted as the announcer introduced the first fight of the night. Jalen bounced lightly on his feet in his corner of the ring, scanning the audience for his family. He spotted Angela and Maya in the front row, their faces beaming with pride. Angela held a handmade sign that read, "Go Jalen! You're our champ!" Across the ring stood his opponent, a taller, stockier boy named Marcus, who had been the favorite to win. But Jalen wasn't intimidated. He remembered Mike's words. "It's about heart, not size," and focused on the task at hand. The bell rang, and the fight began. The first round was rough. Marcus came out swinging, his punches fast and aggressive. Jalen dodged as best he could, but a few solid hits landed, making the crowd gasp. Mike shouted instructions from the corner, his voice steady and calm. "Stay on your feet, Jalen. Keep your guard up." By the second round, Jalen started finding his rhythm. He focused on his training, his footwork, his jab, the lessons Mike had drilled into him over months of practice. Slowly, he began to counter Marcus's attacks, landing a few clean shots that sent ripples of surprise through the crowd. "Attaboy!" Mike shouted, clapping his hands. Angela gripped the edge of her seat, her heart pounding. Maya cheered loudly, her voice lost in the roar of the crowd. By the final round, it was anyone's fight. Both boys were tired, their movements slower but no less determined. Jalen's face was slick with sweat, but his eyes burned with focus. "Give it everything you've got!" Mike yelled from the corner. With 10 seconds left, Jalen unleashed a combination of punches that landed squarely on Marcus's guard, pushing him back against the ropes. The bell rang, ending the fight as the crowd leaped to their feet, applauding both fighters. Jalen stood in the center of the ring, his chest heaving as the referee raised Marcus's hand, declaring him the winner by decision. For a moment, disappointment flickered across Jalen's face, but it quickly faded as Marcus approached him, offering a handshake. "That was a great fight," Marcus said, his tone genuine. "Thanks," Jalen replied, shaking his hand firmly. As Jalen climbed out of the ring, he was met by Mike, who enveloped him in a bear hug. "You did good, kid," Mike said, his voice filled with pride. Real good. Angela and Maya rushed over, wrapping Jalen in hugs and words of encouragement. I'm so proud of you, Angela said, her eyes shimmering with tears. You were amazing out there. Later that evening, the Johnsons and Mike sat together in a booth at a nearby diner, the table crowded with burgers, fries, and milkshakes. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and smiles. You've come a long way, Jalen, Mike said, raising his glass. This is just the beginning. Jalen grinned. I couldn't have done it without you. You did the work, Mike replied. I just showed you the path. Angela chimed in, her voice warm, and we'll keep walking it together. As they left the diner, Jalen glanced up at the night sky, the stars bright and clear. For the first time in years, the weight of struggle felt lighter. He didn't need a championship belt to feel like a winner. He had something far more valuable, a family that believed in him, a mentor who had his back, and a future full of possibility. And though he didn't know what challenges lay ahead, Jalen knew one thing for certain. He would face them with heart, determination, and the lessons he had learned from the man who saw greatness in him before he could see it in himself. The Johnsons piled into their car, their laughter echoing into the night. Somewhere in the distance, Mike Tyson's SUV disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind a family forever changed by his kindness, and a young fighter ready to take on the world. Thank you so much for watching this story. Your support means everything to us. If you enjoyed it and want to see more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear from you. What time are you watching this video, and where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below and let us know. It's always amazing to see how far our community reaches. And remember, every share, like, or comment helps us spread these powerful stories to more people. Thanks for being part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next one.